Well, so recording is so primary and secondary sources. See, the history is written. It is based on the sources. History is to be constructed based on the sources, and the sources are primarily categorized into the two categories, that is primary and secondary sources. So what is called the primary sources and what is called the secondary sources, that we are going to understand today. Primary sources are those sources which are generally found in its original form, and all the archaeological remains, the old remains of the old building, monuments, coins, sculptures, all idols, all these are categorized as the primary sources. Similarly, in the written sources, the sources which are written by the person who was involved in the historical event, who has witnessed the historical event, or who was contemporary of the event or the contemporary of a person. For example, if somebody was contemporary of Chhatrapati Shivaji, his account of Chhatrapati Shivaji is considered as a primary sources. So the person who has witnessed the action, who was contemporary of the action, or who was contemporary of the person. Similarly, autobiography is also a primary source. A person writing about himself is a primary source. And primary sources can be found in its original form, like, the old letters and all, like letters of Nana Fadnavis and all. You will find them in the archive. You will find in the Peshwa Daftar. But there are certain sources which are published also. For example, if there are letters of, let us say, letters of Cornwallis. So it is a primary source for somebody who is doing research on Cornwallis. But if that original letters are given to everybody to handle, probably it will get soiled and it may get damaged. So what generally is done is that those letters are collected by somebody and then they are published in the form of a book. So that is also primary source. Only thing is that when you use that source, you have to mention it that this is a published source. Similarly, translated sources are also considered as a primary sources. For example, my research work, I mostly do it on Mahabharata. Mahabharata is a Sanskrit text originally, and I'm not very good at Sanskrit. So what I do is I generally use the English translation of all those Sanskrit texts. So these all are coming under the primary sources. So primary sources, archaeological remains, account written by the person who has been involved in the event, who was contemporary of the event, who was contemporary of the historical person. Primary sources can be published. Autobiographical account is a primary source. If you write a biography of your contemporary person, obviously it again becomes a primary source. And at the same time, there are translated sources also, which are primary sources. For example, translation of Bible, Ramayana, Mahabharata, so on and so forth. Now, what is the secondary sources? Secondary sources is quite simple. Any book that is written based on all these primary sources. When a historian writes a book, for example, this is a book. So this is, of course, textbook. It is not considered as a very good source when you go for research. It is a textbook which will give you just a kind of elementary ideas about the topic. But in any case, this is written based on the primary and secondary sources. When you write a book, you have to use both the sources, primary and secondary sources. So books read primarily written by using the primary sources as well as the secondary sources. All that is coming under the secondary sources, because when you write a book you have to use primary sources as well as secondary sources. So your book will be considered as a secondary source, but it will be the result of the use of the primary and secondary sources. Now what is the importance of primary and secondary sources? Primary sources are usually the first hand account, eyewitness of the participant, so you can understand how the person has witnessed. The archaeological remains and the coins and idols, they generally remain unaltered. Nobody changes it. So they usually come to you in the pure form. Then what is the use of the secondary source? Secondary source gives you an comprehensive account of the subject. For example, take the case of my PhD. I work on the Bhakti tradition of Maharashtra. So first, I have to read secondary sources, because once I read the secondary sources in the beginning, I will get an overall idea when the Bhakti movement have believed to have started and when it has ended in the medieval period. Who are the important saints who have contributed to the Bhakti tradition? What were the important ideologies that we find in their writing? So I will have a blueprint ready in my mind if I read the secondary source first. If I directly go for the primary source, probably I may not be able to know how I should be interpreting those primary sources, and I don't know where I should start, and I don't know where I should stop. So the things and research might become overwhelmingly complicated for me, and I may not be able to complete my research because research has to be time bound. It's not that I'll just go on reading the Bhakti literature for 10 years, 20 years, and then I will write my thesis. That is not allowed. Once you registered, you have to complete your thesis within a specific period, 4 or 5 years. Uh, Now, so, the secondary sources, it's having importance because it gives you a bird's eye view of the topic that you are going to study. For example, if I give you a research topic about, let us say, temples in Nagpur city. Now, the beginning has to be made from some secondary sources so that at least you will be knowing what are the important temples in the Nagpur city, and then you can go to the individual temple and record your finding. But if you don't know that, the blueprint is not ready, which way you are going to study, which way you are, in which direction you are going. If that is not ready, and if you just go and start with any temple that comes in your way, then probably you will be lost. You will not be focused on the research. Bird's eye view, you understand that? Like, for example, if you go on the top of the Nagpur city in helicopter, you can get a bird's eye view. What are the important temple, up to which area the Nagpur city is spread. The person sitting in the helicopter may not be able to see so much into detail as the person actually walking on the street. But the person walking on the street will be having a very limited vision. So you have to start with the secondary source because that will give you bird's eye view. It will also tell you about the ways and methods of interpreting the primary source. Now, because you will understand how the expert they interpret the primary source, and then at the same time, whatever finding you are trying to take out from your study of the primary source, that will get reinforced because somebody has already worked in the similar direction. Now, everything is written in the primary source. Can we take it granted? Can we take it as a 100% fact? It's very difficult because the all the sources are made by the particular people whose mind are influenced by the particular impression. They have their own attitude. They have their own problem. They have their own attitude to look at the life. They are coming from different position. Like the simple example I gave you, the if you write the history of 2 years that you are going to spend in the department, and if I write the history of that 2 years, it's going to be different because we look at the department from the different perspective. So all that is written in the primary sources not necessarily should be fact, not necessarily should be true, and that is the reason primary sources and secondary sources both are subjected to the internal and external criticism. That of course we are going to discuss it later on. Now, if you want to study your, for example, take the case of newspaper is a primary source. It gives information generally about the contemporary event, what is happening in the country. But everything obviously written in the newspaper is not true. Newspaper have their own biasness. Somebody is in support of government, somebody is opposed to the government. So we have to understand that if the person has written with a particular intention, whether it is a fact or whether it is he is doing his own propaganda, preaching his own thoughts. When you start your research, as I already told you, you need to read some secondary sources first, prepare a blueprint, give direction to your thought, then you go for the primary sources, do the intensive study and interpretation of the primary sources, and then you have to come back to secondary sources once again. You have to read the secondary sources once again, maybe what you have referred earlier, or in addition to that, many more. Because when you read secondary sources once again, first thing happen is that your finding may get reinforced. You understand that what you are interpreted from the primary sources से जो जानकारी आपने निकाली है वो सही है. Second thing is that अगर primary sources से जानकारी निकालते समय उसको interpret करते समय if certain things are left out, you can try to identify those direction from the secondary sources. So the research, ideally speaking, start with secondary sources, then go to the primary sources, and then go back to the secondary sources once again. In the first stage, it is quite possible that you don't have to refer to lot many secondary sources. You may have to refer you refer to the few secondary sources, prepare your blueprint, go for the interpretation of the primary sources, and then in the next stage, that is a maybe last stage, you may have to read as many secondary sources as humanly possible, because that will enrich your content, that will enrich your research. Well, when you interpret the primary sources, there are a number of challenges. For example, it's quite possible that you may not be knowing the language of the primary sources. Like in my case, I don't know very good Sanskrit, but I'm interested in Mahabharata. Somebody who is doing a research on Maratha, those Maratha, the political correspondence of the Marathas used to be written by using the Modi script. And there are a number of people who are not able to read Modi. What we write Marathi is Devanagari script in general. But the Modi script is a little bit different than Devanagari, and you need to have that special skill. Sometimes the primary sources, when they are published, when you use the published primary source, it is quite possible that it might contain some error. So, these are the precautions we need to take while handling the primary sources. And then, there is a possibility that the primary and secondary sources might be interchangeable. How this can happen, I will tell you one example. For example, if your research area is, let us say, caste system in Hinduism, and on the caste system, there will be some original sources. Of course, you might read Manusmriti and Ramayana and Mahabharata and Vedas and try to understand how the caste has evolved. That is the primary sources. But as I told you, it should start with the secondary sources. So you will start with the secondary sources, then you will collect your primary sources. Now here, your main focus is to understand the functioning of the caste in Hinduism, and you come across Dr. Ambedkar's writing on caste. So here, Dr. Ambedkar's writing on the caste is going to be your secondary source, because your main focus area is to understand caste on Hinduism. But if you change your topic, if somebody takes another topic, like if he is writing about the topic of research itself is Dr. Ambedkar's view on caste, then in that case, Dr. Ambedkar's all writing will become your primary source. So that includes Dr. Ambedkar's writing on the caste as well. So there is an interchangeability. The primary source, it is quite possible that, like the case I gave, it's quite possible that that may end up becoming a secondary source sometimes, and the secondary source may end up becoming a primary source. So this is where this was a very small topic. So I told you about the primary and secondary sources. While sculpture remains, archaeological remains are primary sources. They can be translated, they can be published. The written account of the contemporary person is a primary source. The books written on all this is a secondary source. The primary sources, secondary sources both have their own importance. Secondary source gives you a bird's eye view. It reinforces your finding. It gives direction to your thought. And the primary sources gives you the first-hand account. Many primary sources like archaeological remains, they come to us without any, doctoration, without any alteration. It comes to you in the pure form. The research generally has to start with secondary source, goes to primary source, and then again back to the secondary source once again. Though the primary sources are very important, they are not 100% reliable. People write from their own perspective. And when you handle the primary sources, there could be numerous challenges like language, script, and you may need to have a special skill, and there could be error in publishing and translation. There could be an interchangeability between the secondary source and the primary source. All right, so here this topic ends here.